Book 12, Chapter 11 of the Brothers Karamazov. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Translated by Constance Garnett. Book 12, Chapter 11. There was no money. There was no robbery. There was one point that struck everyone in Fetyukovich's speech. He flatly denied the existence of the fatal 3,000 roubles, and consequently the possibility of their having been stolen. "Gentlemen of the jury," he began, "every new and unprejudiced observer must be struck by a characteristic peculiarity in the present case, namely the charge of robbery, and the complete impossibility of proving that there was anything to be stolen. We are told that money was stolen, 3,000 roubles, but whether those roubles ever existed, nobody knows. Consider, how have we heard of that sum, and who has seen the notes? The only person who saw them, and stated that they had been put in the envelope, was the servant, Smerdyakov. He had spoken of it to the prisoner and his brother, Ivan Fyodorovitch, before the catastrophe. Madame Svietlov, too, had been told of it, but not one of these three persons had actually seen the notes. No one but Smerdyakov had seen them. Here the question arises: if it's true that they did exist, and that Smerdyakov had seen them, when did he see them for the last time? What if his master had taken the notes from under his bed and put them back in his cash-box without telling him? Note that according to Smerdyakov's story, the notes were kept under the mattress. The prisoner must have pulled them out, and yet the bed was absolutely unrumpled. That is carefully recorded in the protocol. How could the prisoner have found the notes without disturbing the bed? How could he have helped soiling with his blood-stained hands the fine and spotless linen with which the bed had been purposely made? But I shall be asked, what about the envelope on the floor? Yes, it's worth saying a word or two about that envelope. I was somewhat surprised just now to hear the highly talented prosecutor declare of himself, observe, that but for that envelope, but for its being left on the floor, no one in the world would have known of the existence of that envelope and the notes in it, and therefore of the prisoner's having stolen it. And so that torn scrap of paper is, by the prosecutor's own admission, the sole proof on which the charge of robbery rests. Otherwise, no one would have known of the robbery, nor perhaps even of the money. But is the mere fact that that scrap of paper was lying on the floor a proof that there was money in it, and that that money had been stolen? Yet it will be objected, Smerdyakov had seen the money in the envelope. But when? When had he seen it for the last time? I ask you that. I talked to Smerdyakov, and he told me that he had seen the notes 2 days before the catastrophe. Then why not imagine that old Fyodor Pavlovitch, locked up alone in impatient and hysterical expectation of the object of his adoration, may have whiled away the time by breaking open the envelope and taking out the notes? What's the use of the envelope? He may have asked himself. She won't believe the notes are there, but when I show her the 30 rainbow-colored notes in the roll, it will make more impression, you may be sure. It will make her mouth water. And so he tears open the envelope, takes out the money, and flings the envelope on the floor, conscious of being the owner, and untroubled by any fears of leaving evidence. Listen, gentlemen. Could anything be more likely than this theory, and such an action? Why is it out of the question? But if anything of the sort could have taken place, the charge of robbery falls to the ground. If there was no money, there was no theft of it. If the envelope on the floor may be taken as evidence that there had been money in it, why may I not maintain the opposite, that the envelope was on the floor because the money had been taken from it by its owner? But I shall be asked, what became of the money if Fyodor Pavlovitch took it out of the envelope, since it was not found when the police searched the house? In the first place, part of the money was found in the cash-box, and secondly, he might have taken it out that morning, or the evening before, to make some other use of it, to give or send it away. He may have changed his idea, his plan of action completely, without thinking it necessary to announce the fact to Smerdyakov beforehand. And if there is the barest possibility of such an explanation, how can the prisoner be so positively accused of having committed murder for the sake of robbery, and of having actually carried out that robbery? This is encroaching on the domain of romance. If it is maintained that something has been stolen, the thing must be produced, or at least its existence must be proved beyond doubt. Yet no one had ever seen these notes. Not long ago in Petersburg, a young man of 18, hardly more than a boy, who carried on his small business as a costermonger, went in broad daylight into a money-changer's shop with an axe, and with extraordinary, typical audacity killed the master of the shop and carried off 1,500 roubles. 5 hours later he was arrested, and, except 15 roubles he had already managed to spend, the whole sum was found on him. Moreover, the shopman, on his return to the shop after the murder, informed the police not only of the exact sum stolen, but even of the notes and gold coins of which that sum was made up, and those very notes and coins were found on the criminal. This was followed by a full and genuine confession on the part of the murderer. That's what I call evidence, gentlemen of the jury. In that case I know, I see, I touch the money, and cannot deny its existence. Is it the same in the present case? And yet it is a question of life and death. Yes, I shall be told, but he was carousing that night, squandering money. He was shown to have had 1,500 roubles. Where did he get the money? But the very fact that only 1,500 could be found, and the other half of the sum could nowhere be discovered, shows that that money was not the same, and had never been in any envelope. By strict calculation of time, it was proved at the preliminary inquiry that the prisoner ran straight from those women servants to Perhotin's without going home, and that he had been nowhere. So he had been all the time in company, and therefore could not have divided the 3,000 in half and hidden half in the town. It's just this consideration that has led the prosecutor to assume that the money is hidden in some crevice at Mokroe. Why not in the dungeons of the castle at Udolpho, gentlemen? Isn't this supposition really too fantastic and too romantic? And observe, if that supposition breaks down, the whole charge of robbery is scattered to the winds, for in that case, what could have become of the other 1,500 roubles? By what miracle could they have disappeared, since it's proved the prisoner went nowhere else? And we are ready to ruin a man's life with such tales. I shall be told that he could not explain where he got the 1,500 that he had, and everyone knew that he was without money before that night. Who knew it, pray? The prisoner has made a clear and unflinching statement of the source of that money. And if you have it so, gentlemen of the jury, nothing can be more probable than that statement, and more consistent with the temper and spirit of the prisoner. The prosecutor is charmed with his own romance. A man of weak will, who had brought himself to take the 3,000 so insultingly offered by his betrothed, could not, we are told, have set aside half and sewn it up, but would, even if he had done so, have unpicked it every 2 days, and taken out 100, and so would have spent it all in a month. All this, you will remember, was put forward in a tone what brooked no contradiction. But what if the thing happened quite differently? What if you've been weaving a romance, and about quite a different kind of man? That's just it. You have invented quite a different man. I shall be told, perhaps, there were witnesses that he spent on one day all that 3,000 given him by his betrothed a month before that catastrophe, so he could not have divided the sum in half. But who are these witnesses? The value of their evidence has been shown in court already. Besides, in another man's hand a crust always seems larger, and no one of these witnesses counted that money. They all judged simply at sight. And the witness Maximov has testified that the prisoner had 20,000 in his hand. You see, gentlemen of the jury, psychology is a two-edged weapon. Let me turn the other edge now, and see what comes of it. A month before the catastrophe, the prisoner was entrusted by Katerina Ivanovna with 3,000 roubles to send off by post. But the question is it true that they were entrusted to him in such an insulting and degrading way as was proclaimed just now? The first statement made by the young lady on the subject was different, perfectly different. In the other statement we heard only cries of resentment and revenge, cries of long-concealed hatred. And the very fact that the witness gave her first evidence incorrectly gives us a right to conclude that her second piece of evidence may have been incorrect also. The prosecutor will not, dare not, in his own words, touch on that story. So be it. I will not touch on it either, but will only venture to observe that if a lofty and high-principled person, such as that highly respected young lady unquestionably is, if such a person, I say, allows herself suddenly in court to contradict her first statement, with the obvious motive of ruining the prisoner, it is clear that this evidence has been given not impartially, not coolly. Have we not the right to assume that a revengeful woman might have exaggerated much? Yes, she may well have exaggerated, in particular the insult and humiliation of her offering him the money. No, it was offered in such a way that it was possible to take it, especially for a man so easy-going as the prisoner, above all, as he expected to receive shortly from his father the 3,000 roubles that he reckoned was owing to him. It was unreflecting of him, but it was just his irresponsible want of reflection that made him so confident that his father would give him the money, that he would get it, and so could always dispatch the money entrusted to him and repay the debt. But the prosecutor refuses to allow that he could the same day have set aside half the money and sewn it up in a little bag. That's not his character, he tells us. He couldn't have had such feelings. But yet he talked himself of the broad Karamazov nature. He cried out about the two extremes which a Karamazov can contemplate at once. Karamazov is just a two-sided nature, fluctuating between two extremes, that even when moved by the most violent craving for riotous gaiety, he can pull himself up if something strikes him on the other side. And on the other side is love, that new love which had flamed up in his heart, and for that love he needed money. Oh, far more than for carousing with his mistress. If she were to say to him, "I am yours, I won't have Fyodor Pavlovitch," then he must have money to take her away. That was more important than carousing. Could a Karamazov fail to understand it? That anxiety was just what he was suffering from. What is there improbable in his laying aside that money and concealing it in case of emergency? But time passed, and Fyodor Pavlovitch did not give the prisoner the expected 3,000. On the contrary, the latter heard that he meant to use this sum to seduce the woman he, the prisoner, loved. "If Fyodor Pavlovitch doesn't give the money," he thought, "I shall be put in a position of a thief before Katerina Ivanovna." And then the idea presented to him that he would go to Katerina Ivanovna, lay before her the 1,500 roubles he still carried round his neck, and say, "I am a scoundrel, but not a thief." So here we have already a twofold reason why he should guard that sum of money as the apple of his eye, why he shouldn't unpick the little bag and spend it 100 at a time. Why should you deny the prisoner a sense of honor? Yes, he has a sense of honor, granted that it's misplaced, granted it's often mistaken, yet it exists and amounts to a passion, and he has proved that. But now the affair becomes even more complex. His jealous torment reaches a climax, and those same two questions torture his fevered brain more and more. If I repay Katerina Ivanovna, where can I find the means to go off with Grushenka? If he behaved wildly, drank and made disturbances in the taverns in the course of that month, it was perhaps because he was wretched and strained beyond his powers of endurance. These two questions became so acute that they drove him at last to despair. He sent his younger brother to beg for the last time for the 3,000 roubles, but without waiting for a reply burst in himself and ended by beating the old man in the presence of witnesses. After that he had no prospect of getting it from anyone. His father would not give it him after that beating. The same evening he struck himself on the breast, just on the upper part of the breast, where the little bag was, and swore to his brother that he had the means of not being a scoundrel, but that still he would remain a scoundrel, for he foresaw that he could not use that means, that he wouldn't have the character, that he wouldn't have the will-power to do it. Why? Why does the prosecutor refuse to believe the evidence of Alexei Karamazov, given so genuinely and sincerely, so spontaneously and convincingly? And why, on the contrary, does he force me to believe in money hidden in a crevice in the dungeons of the castle of Udolpho? The same evening, after his talk with his brother, the prisoner wrote that fatal letter, and that letter is the chief, the most stupendous proof of the prisoner having committed robbery. "I shall beg from everyone, and if I don't get it, I shall murder my father, and shall take the envelope with the pink ribbon on it from under his mattress, as soon as Ivan has gone. A full programme of the murder, we are told, so it must have been he. It has all been done as he wrote, cries the prosecutor. But in the first place, it's the letter of a drunken man, and written in great irritation. Secondly, he writes of the envelope from what he has heard from Smerdyakov again, for he has not seen the envelope himself. And thirdly, he wrote it indeed. But how can you prove that he did it? Did the prisoner take the envelope from under the pillow? Did he find the money? Did that money exist indeed? And was it to get money that the prisoner ran off, if you remember? He ran off post-haste, not to steal, but find out where she was, the woman who had crushed him. He was not running to carry out a programme, to carry out what he had written, that is, not for an act of premeditated robbery, but he ran suddenly, spontaneously, in a jealous fury. Yes, I shall be told, but when he got there and murdered him, he seized the money too. But did he murder him after all? The charge of robbery I repudiate with indignation. A man cannot be accused of robbery if it's impossible to state accurately what he has stolen. That's an axiom. But did he murder him without robbery? Did he murder him at all? Is that proved? Isn't that, too, a romance? End of chapter 11 of book 12. Read by J.C. Guan, Montreal, May 2009. Book 12, Chapter 12 of the Brothers Karamazov. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Translated by Constance Garnett. Book 12, Chapter 12. And there was no murder either. Allow me, gentlemen of the jury, to remind you that a man's life is at stake, and that you must be careful. We have heard the prosecutor himself admit that until today he hesitated to accuse the prisoner of a full and conscious premeditation of the crime. He hesitated till he saw that fatal drunken letter which was produced in court today. All was done and written. But I repeat again, he was running to her, to seek her, solely to find out where she was. That's a fact that can't be disputed. Had she been at home, he would not have run away, but would have remained at her side, and so would not have done what he promised in the letter. He ran unexpectedly and accidentally, and by that time, very likely, he did not even remember his drunken letter. He snatched up the pestle, they say, and you will remember how a whole edifice of psychology was built on that pestle. Why he was bound to look at that pestle as a weapon, to snatch it up, and so on, and so on. A very commonplace idea occurs to me at this point. What if that pestle had not been in sight, had not been lying on the shelf from which it was snatched by the prisoner, but had been put away in a cupboard? It would not have caught the prisoner's eye, and he would have run away without a weapon, with empty hands, and then he would certainly not have killed anyone. How then can I look upon the pestle as a proof of premeditation? Yes, but he talked in the caverns of murdering his father, and 2 days before, on the evening when he wrote his drunken letter, he was quiet, and only quarrelled with a shopman in the tavern, because a Karamazov could not help quarrelling, forsooth. But my answer to that is that, if he was planning such a murder in accordance with his letter, he certainly would not have quarrelled even with a shopman, and probably would not have gone into the tavern at all, because a person plotting such a crime seeks quiet and retirement, seeks to efface himself, to avoid being seen and heard, and that not from calculation, but from instinct. Gentlemen of the jury, the psychological method is a two-edged weapon, and we too can use it. As for all this shouting in taverns throughout the month, don't we often hear children or drunkards coming out of taverns shout, "I'll kill you"? But they don't murder anyone. And that fatal letter, isn't that simply drunken irritability too? Isn't that simply the shout of the brawler outside the tavern, "I'll kill you! I'll kill the lot of you"? Why not? Why could it not be that? What reason have we to call that letter fatal rather than absurd? Because his father has been found murdered, because a witness saw the prisoner running out of the garden with a weapon in his hand, and was knocked down by him. Therefore, we are told, everything was done as he had planned in writing, and the letter was not absurd, but fatal. Now, thank God, we've come to the real point. Since he was in the garden, he must have murdered him. In those few words, "since he was, then he must," lies the whole case for the prosecution. He was there, so he must have. And what if there is no must about it, even if he was there? Oh, I admit that the chain of evidence, the coincidences, are really suggestive. But examine all these facts separately, regardless of their connection. Why, for instance, does the prosecution refuse to admit the truth of the prisoner's statement that he ran away from his father's window? Remember the sarcasms in which the prosecutor indulged at the expense of the respectful and pious statements which suddenly came over the murderer. But what if there were something of the sort, a feeling of religious awe, if not of filial respect? My mother must have been praying for me at that moment, were the prisoner's words at the preliminary inquiry, and so he ran away as soon as he convinced himself that Madame Sviatlov was not in his father's house. But he could not convince himself by looking through the window, the prosecutor objects. But why couldn't he? Why? The window opened at the signals given by the prisoner. Some word might have been uttered by Fyodor Pavlovitch, some exclamation which showed the prisoner that she was not there. Why should we assume everything as we imagine it, as we make up our minds to imagine it? 1,000 things may happen in reality which elude the subtlest imagination. Yes, but Grigory saw the door open, and so the prisoner certainly was in the house, therefore he killed him. Now about that door, gentlemen of the jury. Observe that we have only the statement of one witness as to that door, and he was at the time in such a condition that, but supposing the door was open, supposing the prisoner has lied in denying it, from an instinct of self-defense, natural in his position, supposing he did go into the house, well, what then? How does it follow that because he was there he committed the murder? He might have dashed in, run through the rooms, might have pushed his father away, might have struck him. But as soon as he had made sure Madame Sviatlov was not there, he may have run away, rejoicing that she was not there, and that he had not killed his father. and it was perhaps just because he had escaped from the temptation to kill his father, because he had a clear conscience and was rejoicing at not having killed him, that he was capable of a pure feeling, the feeling of pity and compassion, and leapt off the fence a minute later to the assistance of Grigory, after he had, in his excitement, knocked him down. With terrible eloquence the prosecutor has described to us the dreadful state of the prisoner's mind at Mokroe, when love again lay before him, calling him to new life. While love was impossible for him, because he had his father's blood-stained corpse behind him, and beyond that corpse, retribution. And yet the prosecutor allowed him to love, which he explained according to his method, talking about his drunken condition, about a criminal being taken to execution, about it being still far off, and so on, and so on. But again I ask, Mr. Prosecutor, have you not invented a new personality? Is the prisoner so coarse and heartless as to be able to think at that moment of love and of dodges to escape punishment, if his hands were really stained with his father's blood? No, no, no. As soon as it was made plain to him that she loved him, and called him to her side, promising him new happiness, oh, then, I protest, he must have felt the impulse to suicide doubled, trebled, and must have killed himself, if he had his father's murder on his conscience. Oh no, he would not have forgotten where his pistols lay. I know the prisoner. The savage, stony heartlessness ascribed to him by the prosecutor is inconsistent with his character. He would have killed himself, that's certain. He did not kill himself just because his mother's prayers saved him. And he was innocent of his father's blood. He was troubled, he was grieving that night at Mokroe only about old Grigory, and praying to God that the old man would recover, that his blow had not been fatal, and that he would not have to suffer for it. Why not accept such an interpretation of the facts? What trustworthy proof have we that the prisoner is lying? But we shall be told at once again, there is his father's corpse. If he ran away without murdering him, who did murder him? Here, I repeat, you have the whole logic of the prosecution. Who murdered him, if not he? There's no one to put in his place. Gentlemen of the jury, is that really so? Is it positively, actually sure that there is no one else at all? We've heard the prosecutor count on his fingers all the persons who were in that house that night. They were 5 in number. 3 of them, I agree, could not have been responsible. The murdered man himself, old Grigory, and his wife. There are left, then, the prisoner and Smerdyakov. And the prosecutor dramatically exclaims that the prisoner pointed to Smerdyakov because he had no one else to fix on. That, had there been a 6th person, even a phantom of a 6th person, he would have abandoned the charge against Smerdyakov at once in shame, and have accused the other. But, gentlemen of the jury, why may I not draw the very opposite conclusion? There are 2 persons, the prisoner and Smerdyakov. Why can I not say that you accuse my client simply because you have no one else to accuse, and you have no one else only because you have determined to exclude Smerdyakov from all suspicion? It's true indeed, Smerdyakov is accused only by the prisoner, his 2 brothers, and Madame Svietlov. But there are others who accuse him. there are vague rumors of a question, of a suspicion, an obscure report, a feeling of expectation. Finally, we have the evidence of a combination of facts very suggestive, though I admit inconclusive. In the first place, we have precisely on the day of the catastrophe that fit, for the genuineness of which the prosecutor, for some reason, has felt obliged to make a careful defence. Then Smerdyákov's sudden suicide on the eve of the trial. Then the equally startling evidence given in court today by the elder of the prisoner's brothers, who had believed in his guilt, but has today produced a bundle of notes and proclaimed Smerdyákov as the murderer. Oh, I fully share the court's and the prosecutor's conviction that Ivan Karamazov is suffering from brain fever, that his statement may really be a desperate effort, planned in delirium, to save his brother by throwing the guilt on the dead man. But again Smerdyákov's name is pronounced. Again there is a suggestion of mystery. There is something unexplained, incomplete. And perhaps it may one day be explained. But we won't go into that now. Of that later. The court has resolved to go on with the trial, but meantime I might make a few remarks about the character sketch of Smerdyákov drawn with subtlety and talent by the prosecutor. But while I admire his talent, I cannot agree with him. I have visited Smerdyákov. I have seen him and talked to him, and he made a very different impression on me. He was weak in health, it is true, but in character, in spirit, he was by no means the weak man the prosecutor has made him out to be. I found in him no trace of timidity on which the prosecutor so insisted. There was no simplicity about him, either. I found in him, on the contrary, an extreme mistrustfulness concealed under a mask of naivete, and an intelligence of considerable range. The prosecutor was too simple in taking him for weak-minded. He made a very definite impression on me. I left him with the conviction that he was a distinctly spiteful creature, excessively ambitious, vindictive, and intensely envious. I made some inquiries. He resented his parentage, was ashamed of it, and would clench his teeth when he remembered that he was the son of stinking Lizaveta. He was disrespectful to the servant Grigory and his wife, who had cared for him in his childhood. He cursed and jeered at Russia. He dreamed of going to France and becoming a Frenchman. He used often to say that he hadn't the means to do so. I fancy he loved no one but himself, and had a strange high opinion of himself. His conception of culture was limited to good clothes, clean shirt-fronts, and polished boots. Believing himself to be the illegitimate son of Fyodor Pavlovitch, there is evidence of this, he might well have resented his position, compared with that of his master's legitimate sons. They had everything, he nothing. They had all the rights, they had the inheritance, while he was only the cook. He told me himself that he had helped Fyodor Pavlovitch to put the notes in the envelope. The destination of that sum, a sum which would have made his career, must have been hateful to him. Moreover, he saw 3,000 roubles in new rainbow-colored notes. I asked him about that on purpose. Oh, beware of showing an ambitious and envious man a large sum of money at once. And it was the first time he had seen so much money in the hands of one man. The sight of the rainbow-colored notes may have made a morbid impression on his imagination, but with no immediate results. The talented prosecutor, with extraordinary subtlety, sketched for us all the arguments for and against the hypothesis of Smerdyákov's guilt, and asked us in particular what motive he had in feigning a fit. But he may not have been feigning at all. The fit may have happened quite naturally, but it may have passed off quite naturally, and the sick man may have recovered, not completely perhaps, but still regaining consciousness, as happens with epileptics. The prosecutor asks, at what moment could Smerdyákov have committed the murder? But it is very easy to point out that moment. He might have waked up from deep sleep, for he was only asleep. An epileptic fit is always followed by a deep sleep. At that moment, when the old Grigory shouted at the top of his voice, "Parricide!" that shout in the dark and stillness may have waked Smerdyákov, whose sleep may have been less sound at that moment. He might naturally have waked up an hour before. Getting out of bed, he goes almost unconsciously and with no definite motive towards the sound to see what's the matter. His head is still clouded with the attack. His faculties are half asleep. But once in the garden, he walks to the lighted windows, and he hears terrible news from his master, who would be, of course, glad to see him. His mind sets to work at once. He hears all the details from his frightened master, and gradually, in his disordered brain, there shapes itself an idea. Terrible, but seductive, and irresistibly logical. To kill the old man, take the 3,000, and throw all the blame on to his young master. A terrible lust of money, of booty, might seize upon him as he realized his security from detection. Oh, these sudden and irresistible impulses come so often when there is a favorable opportunity, and especially with murderers, who have had no idea of committing a murder beforehand. And Smerdyákov may have gone in and carried out his plan. With what weapon? Why, with any stone picked up in the garden. But what for? With what object? Why, the 3,000, which means a career for him. Oh, I am not contradicting myself. The money may have existed, and perhaps Smerdyákov alone knew where to find it, where his master kept it, and the covering of the money, the torn envelope on the floor. Just now, when the prosecutor was explaining his subtle theory that only an inexperienced thief like Karamazov would have left the envelope on the floor, and not one like Smerdyákov who would have avoided leaving a piece of evidence against himself, I thought, as I listened, that I was hearing something very familiar. And, would you believe it, I have heard that very argument, that very conjecture, of how Karamazov would have behaved, precisely 2 days before, from Smerdyákov himself. What's more, it struck me at the time. I fancied that there was an artificial simplicity about him, that he was in a hurry to suggest this idea to me, that I might fancy it was my own. He insinuated it, as it were. Did he not insinuate the same idea at the inquiry, and suggest it to the talented prosecutor? I shall be asked, what about the old woman, Grigory's wife? She heard the sick man moaning close by all night. Yes, she heard it, but that evidence is extremely unreliable. I knew a lady who complained bitterly that she had been kept awake all night by a dog in the yard. Yet The poor beast, it appeared, had only yelped once or twice in the night, and that's natural. If anyone is asleep and hears a groan, he wakes up, annoyed at being waked, but instantly falls asleep again. 2 hours later, again a groan, he wakes up and falls asleep again, and the same thing again 2 hours later, 3 times altogether in the night. Next morning the sleeper wakes up and complains that someone has been groaning all night and keeping him awake. And it is bound to seem so to him. The intervals of 2 hours of sleep he does not remember. He only remembers the moment of waking. So he feels he has been waked up all night. "But why? Why?" asked the prosecutor. "Did not Smerdyakov confess in his last letter? Why did his conscience prompt him to one step and not to both?" "But excuse me, my conscience implies penitence, and the suicide may not have felt penitence, but only despair. Despair and penitence are two very different things. Despair may be vindictive and irreconcilable, and the suicide, laying his hands on himself, may well have felt redoubled hatred for those whom he had envied all his life. Gentlemen of the jury, beware of a miscarriage of justice. What is there unlikely in all I have put before you just now? Find the error in my reasoning. Find the impossibility, the absurdity. And if there is but a shade of possibility, but a shade of probability in my propositions, do not condemn him. And is there only a shade? I swear by all that is sacred, I fully believe in the explanation of the murder I have just put forward. What troubles me and makes me indignant is that of all the mass of facts heaped up by the prosecution against the prisoner, there is not a single one certain and irrefutable, and yet the unhappy man is to be ruined by the accumulation of these facts. Yes, the accumulated effect is awful. The blood dripping from his fingers, the blood-stained shirt, the dark night resounding with the shout "Parricide," and the old man falling with a broken head. And then the mass of phrases, statements, gestures, shouts. Oh, this has so much influence. It can so bias the mind. But, gentlemen of the jury, can it bias your minds? Remember, you have been given absolute power to bind and to loose. But the greater the power, the more terrible its responsibility. I do not draw back one iota from what I have said just now. But suppose for one moment I agreed with the prosecution that my luckless client had stained his hands with his father's blood. This is only hypothesis, I repeat. I never for one instant doubt of his innocence. But so be it. I assume that my client is guilty of parricide. Even so, hear what I have to say. I have it in my heart to say something more to you, for I feel that there must be a great conflict in your hearts and minds. Forgive my referring to your hearts and minds, gentlemen of the jury, but I want to be truthful and sincere to the end. Let us all be sincere. At this point the speech was interrupted by rather loud applause. The last words, indeed, were pronounced with a note of such sincerity that everyone felt that he really might have something to say, and that what he was about to say would be of the greatest consequence. But the president, hearing the applause in a loud voice, threatened to clear the court if such an incident were repeated. Every sound was hushed, and Fetyukovitch began, in a voice full of feeling, quite unlike the tone he had used hitherto. End of Chapter 12 of Book 12. Recording by J.C. Guan, Montreal, May 2009. Book 12, Chapter 13 of the Brothers Karamazov. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan, The Brothers Karamazov, by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Translated by Constance Garnett. Book 12, Chapter 13. A Corrupter of Thought. It's not only the accumulation of facts that threatens my client with ruin, gentlemen of the jury, he began. What is really damning for my client is one fact, the dead body of his father. Had it been an ordinary case of murder, you would have rejected the charge in view of the triviality, the incompleteness, and the fantastic character of the evidence, if you examine each part of it separately. Or, at least, you would have hesitated to ruin a man's life simply from the prejudice against him which he has, alas, only too well deserved. But it's not an ordinary case of murder. It's a case of parricide. That impresses men's minds, and to such a degree that the very triviality and incompleteness of the evidence becomes less trivial and less incomplete, even to an unprejudiced mind. How can such a prisoner be acquitted? What if he committed the murder and gets off unpunished? That is what everyone, almost involuntarily, instinctively feels at heart. Yes, it's a fearful thing to shed a father's blood, the father who has begotten me, loved me, not spared his life for me, grieved over my illnesses from childhood up, troubled all his life with my happiness, and has lived in my joys, in my successes. To murder such a father, that's inconceivable. Gentlemen of the jury, what is a father, a real father? What is the meaning of that great word? What is the great idea in that name? We have just indicated, in part, what a true father is, and what he ought to be. In the case in which we are now so deeply occupied, and over which our hearts are aching, in the present case, the father, Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, did not correspond to that conception of a father to which we have just referred. That's the misfortune. And indeed, some fathers are a misfortune. Let us examine this misfortune rather more closely. We must shrink from nothing, gentlemen of the jury, considering the importance of the decision you have to make. It's our particular duty not to shrink from any idea, like children or frightened women, as the talented prosecutor happily expresses it. But in the course of his heated speech, my esteemed opponent, and he was my opponent before I opened my lips, exclaimed several times, "Oh, I will not yield the defense of the prisoner to the lawyer who has come down from Petersburg. I accuse, but I defend also." He exclaimed that several times, but forgot to mention that if this terrible prisoner was for 23 years so grateful for a mere pound of nuts given him by the only man who had been kind to him, as a child in his father's house, might not such a man well have remembered, for 23 years, how he ran in his father's backyard, without boots on his feet and with his little trousers hanging by one button, to use the expression of the kind-hearted Dr. Herzenstube. Oh, gentlemen of the jury, why need we look more closely at this misfortune? Why repeat what we all know already? What did my client meet with when he arrived here, at his father's house? And why depict my client as a heartless egoist and monster? He is uncontrolled, He is wild and unruly. We are trying him now for that. But who is responsible for his life? Who is responsible for his having received such an unseemly bringing up, in spite of his excellent disposition and his grateful and sensitive heart? Did anyone train him to be reasonable? Was he enlightened by study? Did anyone love him ever so little in his childhood? My client was left to the care of Providence like a beast of the field. He thirsted perhaps to see his father after long years of separation. 1,000 times perhaps he may, recalling his childhood, have driven away the loathsome phantoms that haunted his childish dreams, and with all his heart he may have longed to embrace and to forgive his father. And what awaited him? He was met by cynical taunts, suspicions, and wrangling about money. He heard nothing but revolting talk and vicious precepts uttered daily over the brandy. And at last he saw his father seducing his mistress from him with his own money. Oh, gentlemen of the jury, that was cruel and revolting. And that old man was always complaining of the disrespect and cruelty of his son. He slandered him in society, injured him, calumniated him, brought up his unpaid debts to get him thrown into prison. Gentlemen of the jury, people like my client, who are fierce, unruly, and uncontrolled on the surface, are sometimes, most frequently indeed, exceedingly tender-hearted, only they don't express it. Don't laugh at my idea. The talented prosecutor laughed mercilessly just now at my client for loving Sheila, loving the sublime and beautiful. I should not have laughed at that in his place. Yes, such natures. Oh, let me speak in defence of such natures, so often and so cruelly misunderstood. These natures often thirst for tenderness, goodness, and justice, as it were, in contrast to themselves. Their unruliness, their ferocity, they thirst for it unconsciously. Passionate and fierce on the surface, they are painfully capable of loving woman, for instance, and with a spiritual and elevated love. Again, do not laugh at me. This is very often the case in such natures. But they cannot hide their passions, sometimes very coarse, and that is conspicuous and is noticed. But the inner man is unseen. Their passions are quickly exhausted. But by the side of a noble and lofty creature, that seemingly coarse and rough man seeks a new life, seeks to correct himself, to be better, to become noble and honourable, sublime and beautiful, however much the expression has been ridiculed. I said just now that I would not venture to touch upon my client's engagement. But I may say half a word. What we heard just now was not evidence, but only the scream of a frenzied and revengeful woman, and it was not for her, oh, not for her, to reproach him with treachery, for she has betrayed him. If she had had but a little time for reflection, she would not have given such evidence. Oh, do not believe her. My client is not a monster, as she called him. The lover of mankind on the eve of his crucifixion said, "I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for his sheep, so that not one of them might be lost. Let not a man's soul be lost through us." I asked just now, "What does Father mean?" and exclaimed that it was a great word, a precious name. But one must use words honestly, gentlemen. and I venture to call things by their right names. Such a father as old Karamazov cannot be called a father, and does not deserve to be. Filial love for an unworthy father is an absurdity, an impossibility. Love cannot be created from nothing. Only God can create something from nothing. Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. The Apostle writes, from a heart glowing with love. It's not for the sake of my client that I quote these sacred words. I mention them for all fathers. Who has authorized me to preach to fathers? No one. But as a man and a citizen, I make my appeal. Vivos voco. We are not long on earth, and we do many evil deeds and say many evil words. So let us all catch a favorable moment, when we are all together, to say a good word to each other. That's what I'm doing. While I am in this place, I take advantage of my opportunity. Not for nothing is this tribune given us by the highest authority. All Russia hears us. I am not speaking only for the fathers here present. I cry aloud to all fathers. Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. Yes, let us first fulfill Christ's injunction ourselves, and only then venture to expect it of our children. Otherwise we are not fathers, but enemies of our children, and they are not our children, but our enemies, and we have made them our enemies ourselves. What measure ye mete, it shall be measured unto you again. It's not I who said that, it's the gospel precept. Measure to others according as they measure to you. How can we blame children if they measure us according to our measure? Not long ago a servant girl in Finland was suspected of having secretly given birth to a child. She was watched, and a box of which no one knew anything was found in the corner of the loft, behind some bricks. It was opened, and inside was found the body of a newborn child which she had killed. In the same box were found the skeletons of 2 other babies which, according to her own confession, she had killed at the moment of their birth. Gentlemen of the jury, was she a mother to her children? She gave birth to them, indeed, but was she a mother to them? Would any one venture to give her the sacred name of mother? Let us be bold, gentlemen. Let us be audacious even. It's our duty to be so at this moment, and not be afraid of certain words and ideas like the Moscow women in Ostrovsky's play, who are scared of the sound of certain words. No, let us prove that the progress of the last few years has touched even us, and let us say plainly, the father is not merely he who begets the child, but he who begets it and does his duty by it. Oh, of course, there is the other meaning, there is the other interpretation of the word father, which insists that any father, even though he be a monster, even though he be the enemy of his children, still remains my father, simply because he begot me. But this is, so to say, the mystical meaning, which I cannot comprehend with my intellect, but can only accept by faith, or, better to say, on faith, like many other things which I do not understand, but which religion bids me believe. But in that case, let it be kept outside the sphere of actual life, in the sphere of actual life which has, indeed, its own rights, but also lays upon us great duties and obligations. In that sphere, if we want to be humane, Christian in fact, we must, or ought to, act only upon convictions justified by reason and experience, which have been passed through the crucible of analysis. In a word, we must act rationally, and not as though in dream and delirium, that we may not do harm, that we might not ill-treat and ruin a man, then it will be real Christian work, not only mystic, but rational and philanthropic." There was a violent applause at this passage from many parts of the court, but Fetyukovitch waved his hands as though imploring them to let him finish without interruption. The court relapsed into silence at once. The orator went on. "Do you suppose, gentlemen, that our children, as they grow up and begin to reason, can avoid such questions? No, they cannot, and we will not impose on them an impossible restriction. The sight of an unworthy father involuntarily suggests tormenting questions to a young creature, especially when he compares him with the excellent fathers of his companions. The controversial answer to this question is: he begot you, and you are his flesh and blood, and therefore you are bound to love him." The youth involuntarily reflects: "But did he love me when he begot me?" he asks, wondering more and more. "Was it for my sake he begot me? He did not know me, not even my sex, at that moment, at the moment of passion perhaps, inflamed by wine, and he has only transmitted to me a propensity to drunkenness. That's all he's done for me. Why am I bound to love him simply for begetting me, when he has cared nothing for me all my life after? Or perhaps those questions strike you as coarse and cruel. But do not expect an impossible restraint from a young mind. Drive nature out of the door, and it will fly in at the window. And above all, let us not be afraid of words, but decide the question according to the dictates of reason and humanity, and not of mystic ideas. How shall it be decided? Why, like this. Let the son stand before his father and ask him, 'Father, tell me, why must I love you? Father, show me that I must love you.' And if that father is able to answer him and show him good reason, we have a real, normal, parental relation, not resting on mystical prejudice, but on a rational, responsible, and strictly humanitarian basis. But if he does not, there's an end to the family tie. He is not a father to him, and the son has a right to look upon him as a stranger, and even an enemy. Our tribune gentlemen of the jury ought to be a school of true and sound ideas." Here the orator was interrupted by irrepressible and almost frantic applause. Of course, it was not the whole audience, but a good half of it applauded. The fathers and mothers present applauded. Shrieks and exclamations were heard from the gallery, where the ladies were sitting. Handkerchiefs were waved. The President began ringing his bell with all his might. He was obviously irritated by the behavior of the audience, but did not venture to clear the court as he had threatened. Even persons of high position, old men with stars on their breasts, sitting on specially reserved seats behind the judges, applauded the orator and waved their handkerchiefs, so that, when the noise died down, the President confined himself to repeating his stern threat to clear the court, and Fetyukovitch, excited and triumphant, continued his speech. "Gentlemen of the jury, you remember that awful night of which so much has been said today, when the son got over the fence and stood face to face with the enemy and persecutor who had begotten him. I insist most emphatically, it was not for money he ran to his father's house. The charge of robbery is an absurdity, as I proved before. And it was not to murder him he broke into the house. Oh no! If he had had that design, he would, at least, have taken the precaution of arming himself beforehand. The brass pestle he caught up instinctively, without knowing why he did it. Granted that he deceived his father by tapping at the window, granted that he made his way in. I've said already that I do not for a moment believe that legend, but let it be so. Let us suppose it for a moment. Gentlemen, I swear to you, by all that's holy, if it had not been his father, but an ordinary enemy, he would, after running through the rooms and satisfying himself that the woman was not there, have made off, post-haste, without doing any harm to his rival. He would have struck him, pushed him away, perhaps, nothing more. For he had no thought and no time to spare for that. What he wanted to know was where she was. But his father, the mere sight of the father, who had hated him from his childhood, had been his enemy, his persecutor, and now his unnatural rival, was enough. A feeling of hatred came over him involuntarily, irresistibly, clouding his reason. It all surged up in one moment. It was an impulse of madness and insanity, but also an impulse of nature, irresistibly and unconsciously, like everything in nature, avenging the violation of its eternal laws. But the prisoner even then did not murder him. I maintain that. I cry that aloud. No, he only brandished the pestle in a burst of indignant disgust, not meaning to kill him, not knowing that he would kill him. Had he not had this fatal pestle in his hand, he would have only knocked his father down perhaps, but would not have killed him. As he ran away, he did not know whether he had killed the old man. Such a murder is not a murder. Such a murder is not a parricide. No, the murder of such a father cannot be called parricide. Such a murder can only be reckoned parricide by prejudice. But I appeal to you again and again from the depths of my soul. Did this murder actually take place? Gentlemen of the jury, if we convict and punish him, he will say to himself, "These people have done nothing for my bringing up, for my education, nothing to improve my lot, nothing to make me better, nothing to make me a man. These people have not given me to eat and to drink, have not visited me in prison and nakedness, and here they have sent me to penal servitude. I am quits. I owe them nothing now, and owe no one anything for ever. They are wicked, and I will be wicked. They are cruel, and I will be cruel." That is what he will say, gentlemen of the jury, and I swear, by finding him guilty, you will only make it easier for him. You will ease his conscience. He will curse the blood he has shed, and will not regret it. At the same time, you will destroy in him the possibility of becoming a new man, for he will remain in his wickedness and blindness all his life. But do you want to punish him fearfully, terribly, with the most awful punishment that could be imagined, and at the same time to save him and regenerate his soul? If so, overwhelm him with your mercy. You will see, you will hear, how he will tremble and be horror-struck. How can I endure this mercy? How can I endure so much love? Am I worthy of it? That's what he will exclaim. Oh, I know that heart, that wild but grateful heart, gentlemen of the jury. It will bow before your mercy. It thirsts for great and loving action. It will melt and mount upwards. There are souls which, in their limitation, blame the whole world. But subdue such a soul with mercy, show it love, and it will curse its past, for there are many good impulses in it. Such a heart will expand and see that God is merciful and that men are good and just. He will be horror-stricken. He will be crushed by remorse and the vast obligation laid upon him henceforth. and he will not say then, "I am quit," but will say, "I am guilty in the sight of all men, and am more unworthy than all." With tears of penitence and poignant, tender anguish he will exclaim, "Others are better than I. They wanted to save me, not to ruin me. Oh, this act of mercy is so easy for you, for in the absence of anything like real evidence it will be too awful for you to pronounce, 'Yes, he is guilty.' Better to acquit 10 guilty men than punish 1 innocent man. Do you hear? Do you hear that majestic voice from the past century of our glorious history? It is not for an insignificant person like me to remind you that the Russian court does not exist for the punishment only, but also for the salvation of the criminal. Let other nations think of retribution and the letter of the law. We will cling to the spirit and the meaning, the salvation and the reformation of the lost. If this is true, if Russia and her justice are such, she may go forward with good cheer. Do not try to scare us with your frenzied troikas from which all the nations stand aside in disgust. Not a runaway troika, but the stately chariot of Russia will move calmly and majestically to its goal. In your hands is the fate of my client. In your hands is the fate of Russian justice. You will defend it. You will save it. You will prove that there are men to watch over it, that it is in good hands. End of chapter 13 of book 12. Recording by J.C. Guan, Montreal, May 2009. Chapter 14 of the Brothers Karamazov. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Translated by Constance Garnett. Book 12, Chapter 14. The Peasants Stand Firm. This was how Fetyukovitch concluded his speech, and the enthusiasm of the audience burst like an irresistible storm. It was out of the question to stop it. The women wept. Many of the men wept too. Even 2 important personages shed tears. The president submitted, and even postponed ringing his bell. The suppression of such an enthusiasm would be the suppression of something sacred, as the ladies cried afterwards. The orator himself was genuinely touched. And it was at this moment that Ippolit Kirillovitch got up to make certain objections. People looked at him with hatred. What? What's the meaning of it? He positively dares to make objections. The ladies babbled. But if the whole world of ladies, including his wife, had protested, he could not have been stopped at that moment. He was pale. He was shaking with emotion. His first phrases were even unintelligible. He gasped for breath, could hardly speak clearly, lost the thread. But he soon recovered himself. Of this new speech of his I will quote only a few sentences. I am reproached with having woven a romance. But what is this defense, if not one romance on top of another? All that was lacking was poetry. Fyodor Pavlovitch, while waiting for his mistress, tears open the envelope and throws it on the floor. We are even told what he said while engaged in this strange act. Is not this a flight of fancy? And what proof have we that he had taken out the money? Who heard what he said? The weak-minded idiot, Smerdyakov, transformed into a Byronic hero, avenging society for his illegitimate birth. Isn't this a romance in the Byronic style? And the son, who breaks into his father's house and murders him without murdering him, is not even a romance. This is a sphinx setting us a riddle which he cannot solve himself. If he murdered him, he murdered him. And what's the meaning of his murdering him without having murdered him? Who can make head or tail of this? Then we are admonished that our tribune is a tribune of true and sound ideas, and from this tribune of sound ideas is heard a solemn declaration that to call the murder of a father parricide is nothing but a prejudice. But if parricide is a prejudice, and if every child is to ask his father why he is to love him, what will become of us? What will become of the foundations of society? What will become of the family? Parricide, it appears, is only a bogey of Moscow merchants' wives. The most precious, the most sacred guarantees for the destiny and future of Russian justice are presented to us in a perverted and frivolous form, simply to attain an object, to obtain the justification of something which cannot be justified. "Oh, crush him by mercy," cries the counsel for the defense. But that's all the criminal wants, and tomorrow it will be seen how much he is crushed. And is not the counsel for the defense too modest in asking only for the acquittal of the prisoner? Why not found a charity in the honor of the parricide to commemorate his exploit among future generations? Religion and the gospel are corrected. That's all mysticism, we are told, and ours is the only true Christianity, which has been subjected to the analysis of reason and common sense. And so they set up before us a false resemblance of Christ. "What measure ye mete, so it shall be meted unto you again," cried the counsel for the defense, and instantly deduces that Christ teaches us to measure as it is measured to us, and this from the tribune of truth and sound sense. We peep into the gospel only on the eve of making speeches, in order to dazzle the audience by our acquaintance with what is, anyway, a rather original composition, which may be of use to produce a certain effect, or to serve the purpose. But what Christ commends us is something very different. He bids us beware of doing this, because the wicked world does this, but we ought to forgive and to turn the other cheek, and not to measure to our persecutors as they measure to us. This is what our God has taught us, and not that to forbid children to murder their fathers is a prejudice. And we will not, from the tribune of truth and good sense, correct the gospel of our Lord, whom the counsel for the defense deigns to call only the crucified lover of humanity, in opposition to all Orthodox Russia, which calls him, "For thou art our God." At this the President intervened and checked the overzealous speaker, begging him not to exaggerate, not to overstep the bounds, and so on, as presidents always do in such cases. The audience, too, was uneasy. The public was restless. There were even exclamations of indignation. Fetyukovitch did not so much as reply. He only mounted the tribune to lay his hands on his heart, and, with an offended voice, utter a few words full of dignity. He only touched again, lightly and ironically, on romancing and psychology, and in an appropriate place quoted, "Jupiter, you are angry, therefore you are wrong," which provoked a burst of approving laughter in the audience. For Ippolit Kirillovitch was by no means like Jupiter. Then Apropos of the accusation that he was teaching the young generation to murder their fathers, Fetyukovitch observed with great dignity that he would not even answer. As for the prosecutor's charge of uttering unorthodox opinions, Fetyukovitch hinted that it was a personal insinuation, and that he had expected in this court to be secure from accusations damaging to my reputation as a citizen and a loyal subject. But at these words the President pulled him up too, and Fetyukovitch concluded his speech with a bow, amid a hum of approbation in the court. And Hippolyte Kirillovitch was, in the opinion of our ladies, crushed for good. Then the prisoner was allowed to speak. Mitya stood up, but said very little. He was fearfully exhausted, physically and mentally. The look of strength and independence with which he had entered in the morning had almost disappeared. He seemed as though he had passed through an experience that day, which had taught him for the rest of his life something very important he had not understood till then. His voice was weak. He did not shout as before. In his words there was a new note of humility, defeat, and submission. What am I to say, gentlemen of the jury? The hour of judgment has come for me. I feel the hands of God upon me. The end has come to an erring man. But, before God, I repeat to you, I am innocent of my father's blood. For the last time I repeat, it wasn't I killed him. I was erring, but I loved what is good. Every instant I strove to reform, but I lived like a wild beast. I thank the prosecutor. He told me many things about myself that I did not know. But it's not true that I killed my father. The prosecutor is mistaken. I thank my counsel too. I cried listening to him. But it is not true that I killed my father, and he needn't have supposed it. And don't believe the doctors. I am perfectly sane, only my heart is heavy. If you spare me, if you let me go, I will pray for you. I will be a better man. I give you my word before God I will. And if you condemn me, I'll break my sword over my head myself and kiss the pieces. But spare me. Do not rob me of my God. I know myself. I shall rebel. My heart is heavy, gentlemen. Spare me. He almost fell back in his place. His voice broke. He could hardly articulate the last phrase. Then the judges proceeded to put the questions, and began to ask both sides to formulate their conclusions. But I will not describe the details. At last the jury rose to retire for consultation. The President was very tired, and so his last charge to the jury was rather feeble. Be impartial. Don't be influenced by the eloquence of the defense, but yet weigh the arguments. Remember that there is a great responsibility laid upon you. And so on, and so on. The jury withdrew, and the court adjourned. People could get up, move about, exchange their accumulated impressions, refresh themselves at the buffet. It was very late, almost 1 o'clock in the night, but nobody went away. The strain was so great that no one could think of repose. All waited with sinking hearts, though that is, perhaps, too much to say, for the ladies were only in a state of hysterical impatience, and their hearts were untroubled. An acquittal, they thought, was inevitable. They all prepared themselves for a dramatic moment of general enthusiasm. I must own there were many among the men, too, who were convinced that an acquittal was inevitable. Some were pleased, others frowned, while some were simply dejected, not wanting him to be acquitted. Fetyukovitch himself was confident of his success. He was surrounded by people congratulating him and fawning upon him. "There are," he said to one group, as I was told afterwards, "there are invisible threads binding the counsel for the defense with the jury. One feels during one's speech if they are being formed. I was aware of them. They exist. Our cause is won. Set your mind at rest." "What will our peasants say now?" said one stout, cross-looking, pock-marked gentleman, a landowner of the neighborhood, approaching a group of gentlemen engaged in conversation. "But they are not all peasants. There are 4 government clerks among them." "Yes, there are clerks," said a member of the district council, joining the group. "And do you know that Nazariev, the merchant with the medal, a juryman? What of him? He is a man with brains, but he never speaks. He is no great talker, but so much the better. There is no need for the Petersburg man to teach him. He could teach all Petersburg himself. He is the father of 12 children. Think of that! Upon my word, you don't suppose they won't acquit him?" one of our young officials exclaimed in another group. "They'll acquit him for certain," said a resolute voice. "It would be shameful, disgraceful, not to acquit him," cried the official. "Suppose he did murder him? There are fathers and fathers. And besides, he was in such a frenzy. He really may have done nothing but swing the pestle in the air, and so knocked the old man down. But it was a pity they dragged the valet in. That was simply an absurd theory. If I'd been in Fetyukovitch's place, I should simply have said straight out, 'He murdered him, but he is not guilty. Hang it all!' That's what he did, only without saying 'hang it all.' No, Mihail Semyonovitch." "He almost said that too," put in a third voice. "Why, gentlemen, in Lent an actress was acquitted in our town who had cut the throat of her lover's lawful wife." "Oh, but she did not finish cutting it." "That makes no difference. She began cutting it." "What did you think of what he said about children? Splendid, wasn't it?" "Splendid." "And about mysticism too." "Oh, drop mysticism, do!" cried someone else. "Think of Hippolyte and his fate from this day forth. His wife will scratch his eyes out tomorrow for Mitya's sake. Is she here? What an idea! If she'd been here she'd have scratched him out in court. She is at home with toothache. He he he! He he he!" In a third group, "I dare say they will acquit Mitenka, after all. I shall not be surprised if he turns the metropolis upside down tomorrow. He will be drinking for 10 days. Oh, the devil! The devil's bound to have a hand in it. Where should he be, if not here? Well, gentlemen, I admit it was eloquent, but still it's not the thing to break your father's head with a pestle. Or what are we coming to? The chariot! Do you remember the chariot? Yes, he turned the cart into a chariot. And tomorrow he will turn a chariot into a cart, just to suit his purpose. What cunning chaps there are nowadays! Is there any justice to be had in Russia?" But the bell rang. The jury deliberated for exactly an hour, neither more nor less. A profound silence reigned in the court as soon as the public had taken their seats. I remember how the jurymen walked into the court. At last. I won't repeat the questions in order, and indeed I have forgotten them. I remember only the answer to the president's first and chief question. Did the prisoner commit the murder for the sake of robbery, and with premeditation. I don't remember the exact words. There was a complete hush. The foreman of the jury, the youngest of the clerks, pronounced in a clear, loud voice, amidst the death-like stillness of the court: "Yes, guilty." And the same answer was repeated to every question: "Yes, guilty," and without the slightest extenuating comment. This no one had expected. Almost every one had reckoned upon a recommendation to mercy, at least. The death-like silence in the court was not broken. All seemed petrified. Those who desired his conviction, as well as those who had been eager for his acquittal. But that was only for the first instant, and it was followed by a fearful hubbub. Many of the men in the audience were pleased. Some were rubbing their hands with no attempt to conceal their joy. Those who disagreed with the verdict seemed crushed, shrugged their shoulders, whispered, but still seemed unable to realize this. But how shall I describe the state the ladies were in? I thought they would create a riot. At first they could scarcely believe their ears. Then suddenly the whole court rang with exclamations. "What's the meaning of it? What next?" They leapt up from their places. They seemed to fancy that it might be at once reconsidered and reversed. At that instant Mitya suddenly stood up and cried in a heart-rending voice, stretching his hands out before him: "I swear by God and the dreadful day of judgment, I am not guilty of my father's blood. Katya, I forgive you. Brothers, friends, have pity on the other woman." He could not go on. He broke into a terrible sobbing wail that was heard all over the court, in a strange, unnatural voice unlike his own. From the farthest corner at the back of the gallery came a piercing shriek. It was Grushenka. She had succeeded in begging admittance to the court again before the beginning of the lawyer's speeches. Mitya was taken away. The passing of the sentence was deferred till next day. The whole court was in a hubbub, but I did not wait to hear. I only remember a few exclamations I heard on the steps as I went out. "He'll have a 20 years' trip to the mines, not less, while our peasants have stood firm, and have done for our Mitya." End of Book 12. End of Part 4 of the Brothers Karamazov. Recording by J.C. Guan, May 2009.